We hear a lot of critiques of Marxism from people who are against it, right? But what happens when that critique comes from the inside? Today, we're diving into the work of economist Samir Amin. He argued that Marxism, for all its incredible power, has this one massive blind spot. It sees the entire world through a purely European lens. So let's unpack what that actually means.
So let's start with this quote from Amin himself. Look, he got it. He knew that in the West, it's kind of fashionable to just dismiss Marx. But for Amin, Marx's core idea, this concept of economic alienation, that capitalism fundamentally separates us from our own work, that idea is more vital than ever. So the point here isn't to trash Marx, not at all. It's to build on what he started.
And this is where it gets really interesting. This is the central question Amin is asking. What if the very tools we're using to critique capitalism are, well, flawed themselves? Amin saw the Marxism that was actually being practiced out in the world as an unfinished construct. A really powerful idea, for sure, but one that was still trapped by the exact European worldview it was trying to break free from.
Okay, so here's our game plan for today. First, we're going to define what this Eurocentric blind spot actually is. Then we'll look at how it created this kind of one-way map of history. After that, we'll see how that map just completely clashed with the reality of global capitalism. And finally, we'll dig into Amin's alternative way of looking at the world.
So what is this blind spot? Well, Amin's whole argument is that while Marx was a genius at critiquing capitalism, which was a product of the European Enlightenment, Marxism itself never fully escaped its own origins. It basically inherited this tendency from the Enlightenment to see European history as the only history, the default history, which created this Eurocentric lens for viewing the entire planet.
So let's be super clear. This is not about throwing Marx's ideas out the window. Amin's whole project was to make Marxism stronger by facing its weak spots head-on, especially its really flawed understanding of world history and its vision for what comes after capitalism.
All right, let's get into the first big critique. Amin says that Marxism essentially took the unique, specific historical path of Europe and tried to turn it into a universal law for everyone, everywhere. And in doing so, it created a really flawed map of history.
And wow, this slide just lays it all out, doesn't it? In this view, history has two roads. You've got the European road, which is presented as this dynamic superhighway, the one that leads to progress and capitalism. But then you have the Asiatic road, which represents these huge ancient civilizations in Asia and Africa. And it's seen as a dead end, a stagnant society, just stuck, totally unable to evolve on its own terms.
And here's where it gets really rigid. This is the infamous 5 stages theory, which Stalin pushed really hard. It took Europe's specific story, from slavery to feudalism to capitalism, and just declared it the one and only path for all of humanity. Amin had a great name for this. He called it an iron corset, because it forced the incredible diversity of global history into this one stiff, uncomfortable, European-sized model. Okay, let's pivot to Amin's second major critique. This one is all about Marx's predictions. See, Marx thought that as capitalism spread across the globe, it would unite the world's workers against their common enemy. But as Amin points out, what actually happened with capitalism was the total opposite. Marx's vision was all about homogenization. What does that mean? Well, he basically thought that over time, capitalism would just erase all the cultural and national differences, creating one giant global working class, the proletariat. And this massive united force would then rise up in a world revolution. It was a pretty optimistic idea, but it's just not what happened. This slide shows you the clash perfectly. Instead of homogenization, of bringing everyone together, capitalism created polarization. It split the world into a wealthy, dominant center, the industrialized nations, and an exploited periphery. And because of that, the real revolutionary energy didn't come from the workers in the center, it shifted to the oppressed people on the periphery. And this table just makes that polarization so clear. In the center, wages generally go up as productivity goes up. That creates a certain social stability, and it allows for things like electoral democracy. But in the periphery, wages are kept low, totally detached from how productive workers are. This creates massive inequality and makes any kind of stable democracy almost impossible. They're two completely different worlds, created by the very same system. Okay, so if the old Marxist map is totally busted, what's the new one look like? This is where Amin comes in with his own groundbreaking ideas, a whole new framework to explain the global economy without that Eurocentric bias we've been talking about. First off, Amin just tosses out that old, condescending idea of a stagnant, Asiatic mode. He replaces it with something called the tributary mode. He argues that the great empires of China and the Arab world, they weren't failures.
No, they were the advanced central forms of this system. And then, and this is the brilliant part, he completely flips the script. He says that European feudalism was actually a more primitive, a more peripheral version of it. And it's precisely because Europe was less developed that it was flexible enough for capitalism to pop up there first. Mind-blowing, right?
So how does this polarization actually work? Well, the engine driving it all, according to Amin, is unequal development. The idea here is that capitalism isn't a rising tide that lifts all boats. Nope. Its core logic actually depends on a massive, non-stop transfer of wealth from the periphery to the center.
And the fallout from this is just massive. It means global inequality isn't some accident. It's a feature of the system, and it's constantly being remade. It explains why politics are so different in the center versus the periphery. And here's the real kicker. It means that for countries on the periphery, true, meaningful development within the current rules of the global game is basically impossible. So this all leads to Amin's most radical and probably most famous idea, delinking. Now, it's really important to get this right. This does not mean cutting yourself off from the world and becoming a hermit kingdom. Not at all. It means that nations in the periphery have to consciously break from the logic of the global system. They have to start building their economies and societies based on the needs of their own people instead of just serving the demands of the center.
And that leaves us with this final, really challenging question. Amin's work kind of forces us to ask what progress or development even means. I mean, if the global system is fundamentally designed to create winners and losers, to polarize the world, not to equalize it, then what are we really talking about when we use the word development? What can progress possibly look like for a nation that's basically playing a game where the rules were rigged from the very start? That's a question that really cuts to the heart of our entire global economy.